Good morning. This is Brent Vandervoort. I'm the owner of Fat Man Fabrications, and our video this morning is going to talk about coil spring selection. Coilovers are a little bit easier because we can easily change the spring rate and have the same mounting. That's another story altogether, a video for another time. But the number one tech question we get day in, day out, week after week, year after year is, you've sent me such and such a coil spring for my car, it seems way too heavy. And very often we find out that the customer is putting in a spring way too soon. If you don't have all the weight on it, radiator, hood, water, glass, interior, all those things add up. If you try and put the spring in too soon, there's no way you're going to be able to get the correct spring for that system. You have to have all the weight on it. So the question is, what do you do while you're building the car? Well, in your kit, when you have a stage 2 using conventional coil springs, we include a shock spacer. It's a simple piece of tube, and rather than have a separate strut that some people use to hold the car up at ride height while you're working on it, we provide this simple thing. Now, this customer is doing a large 38 Packard convertible sedan, heavy car, using an new LT series engine in it. But because it's a heavy car, he went to the Ride Tech Premium coilover. Great idea. The English call these dampers, which is a better word for what they do. They don't absorb shock. They're used to damp the motion of the suspension, so the heavier car really benefits by the better shock. And what's amazing about shock technology in the last 10 or 15 years, it used to be you had to give up ride to get handling or handling to get ride. Now, this valving is so sophisticated inside the shock, you get both in the same package. So back to our story about the springs. How do you hold up the car while you're working on it if you don't have the weight on? Well, what we're going to do is we remove all the upper shock hardware. We drop on a simple shock spacer, typical washer, typical bushing. And when you bolt this in, this will compress that shock, close up this section here, and that's the ride height for it. You'll notice that's about halfway on the shock travel. That's exactly where your shock should be mounted, so you have as much extension travel available to you as you have compression travel. Never forget, ride height and ride quality is usually all about shock travel. So now I want to talk about the spring we're going to use. We have essentially 4 springs that we use on this type of suspension using a conventional coil spring with a conventional shock mounted inside like you get in a production car. Very quickly, flat top is ground flat, the seat up inside, and there's an open tail on the bottom. We'll show you shortly how that registers properly on the lower arm. This is the heaviest spring that we have. This being a heavy car, we feel like this is going to be what we're going to start with. We've been doing this 34 years, so we have a pretty good idea what spring you're going to need for your car, body style, wheelbase, engine weight, all the things that go into spring selection. Now, if we're going to ever err, we'll err on the heavy side because it's a lot easier to trim a little bit off a spring than it is to add some back. Now, up to a full coil, you'll notice no effect at all on the ride quality. So if you have to trim it a little bit. So we're going to stop for a moment now and set up. And we're not going to put this spring in because I know it's going to sit way too high right now. Let's go to the car and put in a set of springs we know are wrong. Alright, for our next installment in putting the coil springs in this car, we're going to purposely put in a spring that I know is cut too short. As you can see in this car, we do not have all the weight on it. And I want to show you what's going to happen with this in terms of ride height. Now, one of the things we're going to show you is kind of the procedure how to put the spring in. I'm going to be just doing the talking and the filming while Pete the Order does the installing. So here comes Pete, and we're going to show you how this all works. Normally we wouldn't have the car this far off the ground. Normally it would be almost at ride height, just to put it down. But this car takes a lot to put the nose back on with all the dual side mounts and everything. So we've left it in the air to save the trouble of this back place. Now, one thing I want you to notice is there's a spring pad on this lower control arm. There's a notch in it that keeps the spring from rotating. The open tail of the spring goes against that notch. What I mean to show you is that it sits like so. We'll get a close-up of that shortly. I'm going to go back behind the camera while Pete does the work. That's part of the neat part about being a boss. I get to stand back here while he does the work. I'm going to zoom in a little bit for you. Now you'll notice that we've disconnected the tie rod, the spindle, the shock, the sway bar, everything, so that we have nothing in our way to get that spring in there. Now Pete's just going to continue bringing that up, and eventually that lower control arm is going to get level. We'll stop for a second, give you a close-up on that spring seat. Okay, now here's where I'm showing you the detail on that spring. Notice that the end of the spring goes against this tapered block to keep it from rotating. If you turn it the other way around, the car can never sit right because that molded spring seat has a taper molded into it that receives that open wound end of the spring. Okay, Pete is now jacking up on that spring using the floor jack, just as you see. And you're going to find that about the time that lower arm gets level, it's going to start picking the car off the jack stand. That's a pretty good sign that with this amount of weight, we'd have about the right spring. Now I want you to notice that we're trying to get that lower control arm level. That's the ideal position because that gives us the correct shock travel we talked about a minute ago. But you can see that that's going to hold up this car just about right with this spring. Now we're going to stop, take this out, and put the correct spring back in it. Okay, now this time Pete is putting in a different spring, the one that we expect is going to be correct for the car. You'll notice that this particular one is coated silver. Okay, now this is the point where a lot of guys seem to kind of go into panic mode. It looks like there's no way that spring will ever compress. But remember, we don't have all the weight on it, nor do we really have all the leverage because the wheel center is going to be further outboard than the ball joint. So that gives you more leverage to compress that spring. But as Pete continues here, we're going to see that that lower arm is not going to get level, which is to be expected. You also notice that the spring is being forced into a bit of a curve, and that's because the lower arm is not level yet. Now he's just trying to keep that spring from rotating away from that stop, because that can happen when you're putting it up in there. Now as he comes up, see, now this car is starting to come off the jack stand. It's probably hard to see, but it is. We're at the limit of the jack right there. But that actually right now, to the average guy, looks like he has way too much spring. But we don't have all the car on there yet. I just can't say that enough times. All right, we're going to stop here. They're going to put the rest of the car together, and we'll show you what we have when all the weight, including the fenders, is on it. Okay, so now Pete is continuing to put the front end together on the left, and Dan is helping him on the right-hand side so we can proceed. Right now, you can see that this is the spring we think is going to be correct. Not that black one we put in a minute ago we knew was too short. This is a good place to be able to put the spindle in. The shock is there. It'll stop the down travel of the spring. It acts as an extension stop for the moment. Now we're just going to put on the spindle, and we'll have the suspension together ready to put the rest of the car together. Okay, while Dan finishes putting the right-hand side together, we're going to show you the left-hand finished up. Everything's bolted in. I want to see a couple of fine points that Pete mentioned. Is that notice that the outer tie rod end has some of the stud exposed past the boot. The boot does not come up all the way to the spindle as you see in most tie rod ends. Anytime you're doing a power rack, we recommend more positive caster. Well, when you take a front steer spindle and you rake it back further than it's originally designed to do, it ends up raising that outer tie rod end. We call these G-Tech tie rod ends because they take care of that. Otherwise, if you use a standard tie rod end, you've actually induced a little bit of bump steer from the outer tie rod end being too high. That's why these are 3/4 inch longer. So we wanted to show you that. Another point, try and get into, this is in the instructions, as most everything is. But on that lower control arm, if you look real close underneath the castle nut, you'll see an aluminum spacer. That's important that it be in that position and use it to raise the castle nut up, or the cotter pin hole will work out with the castle nut. Now, we ship those on the stud, and sometimes guys forget to take it off the stud and try and bolt the spindle on. But then the taper can never grab the spindle stud, the ball joint stud I should say, and people call up and tell us that their ball joints are loose. Brand new ball joints are not going to be loose unless they're assembled wrong. You must put that spacer under the nut as it shows. But to the point of what we're talking about here, really, right now, I'm going to zoom out. This is going to get a little unsteady for a second. Right now, this is where the suspension is. And this is where a lot of guys will call, say, this is way too much spring, it's not going to sit right. I've had two of my fat buddies that eat a lot of pizza and beer jump on the front, it doesn't go up and down. None of that is going to work to tell you how much spring you need. You're not going to know how much spring you need until the car is all together. Now, we've done this enough, we feel like this is the right spring. But now we're going to put all the sheet metal on it, and we're going to find out for sure. So we'll be back when that's ready. Okay, the guys have finished putting our 38 Packard sample car together, and you can see the tire is just a little bit low in the fender. We'd like to see that up in there a little bit higher, give us some daylight over the tread, maybe cover an inch or inch and a half of the tire tread. Now we're going to look at what the spring angle is. Okay, as you can see, the control arm is still not quite level. We're running downhill from the frame out to the lower ball joint, but that's totally okay, because we don't have the very heavy Packard radiator, grill shell, hood, all those other things on there that make up a complete car. This is really a pretty good place to be if you want to mock up the car with the spring without all the weight, but we're certainly not going to make the mistake of cutting that spring to get the arm level now. We've got 500 pounds worth of Packard to put on there yet. So whether you've got a Chevy, a Ford, a Buick, doesn't matter. You see, the issue is you really can't finish setting the spring until you're finished with the car.